All right, Joe, we can probably go ahead and get started, and I'll just keep an eye on the waiting room and let folks in as they join.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Disability in the Workplace. This is a partnership between the Student Disability Center and the Career Center in celebration of October, which is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. My name is Joe Tyner. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I serve as an accommodation specialist in the Student Disability Center.
And my name is Madigan Turnquist. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am a career education coordinator in CSU's Career Center. Joe, you're muted.
I don't know how that happened, but sorry about that.
No, you're good.
As we get started, we want to go over just a couple pieces of Zoom etiquette and access needs. So please feel free to join or leave as you feel comfortable. We know people have different schedules. Feel free to turn your camera on or off, whichever feels most comfortable for you. There are captions being provided. We are using the built-in auto captioning feature in Microsoft PowerPoint, which is fairly accurate. However, it's not 100% accurate, so I apologize for any inconsistencies if you rely on the captions. The key pieces of content we're talking about will be on the slides. So if something is mistranslated in the captions, hopefully the slides will clarify things. If you don't mind, please keep your mics muted. If you're not speaking, it just helps cut down on background noise, and that helps keep the captions more accurate. Feel free to ask questions throughout. You can either ask questions by posting them in the chat or unmuting yourself and asking them. If you would like, an accessible PDF version of these PowerPoint slides are available. You can either access them by going to tinyurl.com/disabilityintheworkplace, and that link is going to be posted in the chat.
And then just to go over a quick agenda, what we're going to talk about today, we'll start with some context. So why is this important? Why are we talking about this? An overview of disability and of federal non-discrimination laws. That's going to be some going through some of the legal content there. Disclosing a disability, so how and when to disclose a disability to an employer. Just some general job searching tips and tricks. And then the Workforce Recruitment Program, which is a recruitment program specifically for students and recent graduates with disabilities that is actually recruiting right now. Applications are due in a week, and so I'll get a little bit more into the details about that and how you can apply if you're interested in that. And then we will end with resources and questions. Just a few disclaimers. So Joe and I are not lawyers. We are not experts on disability law. We're just folks who have done a little bit of research and want to share that research with all of you. And every workplace is different. So these are going to be some kind of general overviews of good practices and helpful tips and tricks. And know that every individual workplace might have different rules and regulations, and conversations might look different depending on what the field is and what the specific workplace is. Also want to note I see a lot of staff here. Hello staff, it's great to see you. And some of this content will be kind of specific for students. So hopefully still useful to staff as you work with students, but just wanted to note that ahead of time as well.
Madigan, this is your slide.
Oh, thank you. I was reading the question in the chat, and Jennifer, I will respond to that about how to use the captions in PowerPoint. So why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about disability in the workplace? And wanted to share some stats about kind of what does disability look like in the workplace in terms of unemployment and opportunity. And so right now, or this data was from 2019, only 30.9% of people with a disability between the ages of 16 and 64, so that kind of common working age, were employed, compared to 74.6% of people without a disability in that same age group. And that's just to note that there are some very real barriers, right? This is a very real thing for folks, and may be different depending on what the disability is, but just wanted to note that there is a relatively severe underemployment rate. The employment population ratios were lower for people with disabilities across all age groups and educational attainment levels, and people with a bachelor's degree were more likely to be employed than those without a degree within that same disability status. So if you are a student with a disability that is currently pursuing your undergraduate degree, you are already in a better position and a good position to find a stable job. And our hope, of course, is that all of you are able to do that. And so we wanted to note that there are very real barriers, and we hope that understanding rights, protections, how to have a disclosure conversation is not one of those barriers. And so that's the conversation that we want to have with you all today.
Okay, as we get into this next section, I want to apologize. These next few slides get a little technical, get into a little bit of like legal language, so it might be slightly confusing, but I will try to break it down as best I can. As I've said before, if you have any questions, feel free to pose them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them if you need further clarification. So I want to start off by identifying what a person with a disability is. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the federal law which protects people with disabilities from discrimination and provides them equal access to things such as employment and housing and education, defines a person with a disability as either being one or all three of these things. So having a physical or mental health condition that substantially limits one or more major life functions or activities, has a record of such impairments, or is regarded as having a medical, physical or mental impairment. And so what this means is if you have, someone like myself, I have a visual impairment. So I have a documented physical impairment that impacts with my daily one or more of my major life activities. So I'm considered having being a person with a disability, having a record of such. So that could be someone who maybe isn't currently experiencing any difficulties because of their disability, but has had a temporary disability in the past or has gone through something that has affected their major life activities in the past. And because of that, they may be seen as still having a disability, or who is regarded as such. And so this one gets a little more technical into when you look at discrimination of, are you assuming someone has a disability because of how they present, how they act, even if you don't know for certain, they've not shared it, you don't have any proof, but you just think someone has one, or if someone has been maybe given accommodations previously without formal documentation or being formally diagnosed, they are still then regarded as a person with a disability. So I mentioned, having a disability means you have a mental or physical condition that affects one or more major life activities. So I wanted to break that down a little bit more. A major life activity is different aspects of our life that we do. So things like moving, communicating, seeing, hearing, learning, sleeping, these are all major life activities that we do on a regular basis. And so if you have any sort of condition that impacts one of those substantially, that's considered having a disability. The ADA uses 3 factors when determining whether a person's disability or impairment substantially limits one of these major life activities. And so it's the nature and frequency of the impairment. So like I said myself, I have a visual impairment. That's a lifelong constant thing that's constantly impacting my life activities. The expected duration of the impairment. And so maybe it's someone who, for example, someone with a temporary condition, maybe someone who's broken their leg and is on crutches or using a wheelchair, is having that major life activity of walking limited for the next, 8 weeks while they recover. Or the permanency and long-term impact of that impairment. So an example of this could be maybe someone, gets a concussion or a head injury, and it is first time maybe it'll be a concussion and last just that short amount of time, but then as the person's recovering, they're developing further complications such as post-concussion syndrome, or things that are going to impact them more long-term. And so if any of these things are impacting a major life activity, that's what reaches the level of a disability. So as I mentioned, this is all defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Amendments Act of 2008. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal non-discrimination law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination and provides them equal access to things like housing, education, and the workplace and transportation. And it is the law under what a lot of this protection and accommodations I'm going to talk about is founded. So how does the ADA protect people with disabilities? And so Title I of the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations in three primary areas. So accommodations to provide equal opportunity to the job application process. So ensuring that if you have, if you post a job, if you're an employer and you post a job online, that for example, the application is accessible. If you have applications available like in office, being sure they're available in an accessible way, or that someone with a disability can reasonably access them. And same like going through that hiring process. So all steps of that are provided accommodations or provided equal access in their design. Accommodations that enable workers to complete job functions that are essential to the fundamental pieces of the position. So if you're in a job, if you need an accommodation to complete one of the essential functions, you were given that reasonable accommodation. And I'll dive more into what accommodations are and what essential functions are in a couple slides. And then finally, accommodations that allow people with disabilities to enjoy all benefits and privileges of employment, such as cafeterias, lounges, rec rooms, etc. So this goes into the benefit side. So I'll use the example of here at CSU as employees. We have access to different resources, such as our medical benefits, to paid time off, as well as things like we can buy, staff passes to the student rec center, use the campus dining halls. And so because those are benefits available to us, all of those facilities have to be accessible, or we have to be provided accommodations for them. The ADA also prohibits employers from asking employees for medical documentation before or during the application process. The exception to this is that federal employees like CSU can ask applicants to voluntarily disclose demographics, and that's used for tracking affirmative action statistics. And again, that's just, you don't have to disclose that, it's a voluntary disclosure. So I mentioned the ADA provides reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities. And so reasonable accommodations are any modification or accommodation to a job, practice, policy, or the work environment that enables a qualified person with a disability to perform the essential functions of the position, as long as it does not create an undue hardship on the employer. And I'll add a note with as an employer, proving an undue hardship is very difficult. Historically, courts usually tend to settle with the person with a disability. So I know there was a case of a person who uses a wheelchair working in a call center, and the call center was not accessible for them to get in and out of. They asked for it to be made accessible, and the courts ruled in their favor that spending a large amount of money to create an accessible facility was not an undue hardship on the business. As I mentioned, the reasonable accommodations and the ADA mentioned being a qualified person with a job. So being a qualified employee or applicant with a disability means that the employer applicant must meet all the required qualifications of the job and be able to fulfill the essential functions of the job using either with or without an accommodation. So that's meaning, if the job requires a bachelor's degree and this much experience, the applicant meets all of those requirements. And then when it comes to doing the work, can they do the work with an accommodation or can they do it without an accommodation? So some examples of reasonable accommodations are, an accessible work environment, use of assistive technology or adaptive hardware, flexible work arrangement, use of sign language interpreters for those who might be deaf, use of accessible or alternative format materials for those who may be blind or visually impaired. This is not an exhaustive list, and accommodations are always determined on a case-by-case basis. There's not a set list that can be picked and chosen from. It's always determined on a case-by-case basis with each employer, each employee, and in each job. Okay. As I mentioned, accommodations cannot undermine or alter an essential function of a job. So essential functions are considered, or functions of a job are considered essential if all employees in the position are required to perform those specific duties. They are functions that would fundamentally change the position if removed. The position exists to perform those specific functions. A limited number of other employees are available to perform those functions, and the functions are highly specialized, and the person in the position is hired for specifically to complete those functions. And so I'll use an example, again, use a personal example of, so again, I have a visual impairment, I'm not able to drive for that. If I applied for a job as a bus driver, an essential function of that job is being able to drive and drive a bus. There's not an accommodation that I can be given that reasonably provides me access to that job without undermining that essential function or moving it. So I'm not, in that position, I'm not considered a qualified applicant. However, the job I have now at the Student Disability Center, I can do that job fully because I am a qualified person. I meet the requirements of the job. None of the job requirements are altered by the accommodations I use, which is primarily using assistive technology to access computers. So that's a reasonable accommodation. I just want to cover a couple limitations of the ADA. While it is a really useful law, it does have its limits. So the ADA does not apply to employers who have 15 or less employees, and that is for the whole size of the organization. So I'll use the example of here at CSU, we have different departments and different offices, and some of them are quite small. So if you work in an office that only has 10 employees, you are under that 15 number, but because you're part of CSU, which is a larger organization, CSU as the whole has more than 15 employees, so they are covered under the ADA. So this would be something specific to maybe very small, like shops, very small restaurants, things where there are no more than 15 employees total for the whole organization. And employers only have to provide accommodations if they know the need for an accommodation is needed. So an employee has to disclose and let the employer know they need accommodations. Otherwise, the employer does not have to provide them.
A quick question. Can you expand on that point, if you don't mind? Is that, does it need to be a formal process where the employee says, I need, or I have an accommodation, or can it just be mentioned in passing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does need to be like a formal request to a supervisor, and then this is where that every workplace will look different on how that process might go. Like here at CSU, we have the Office of Equal Opportunity, which helps facilitate that process. Other employers, there might be an HR department that does this, or it may just be a conversation between the employee and the supervisor, but it does have to say, hey, I have a disability and I need an accommodation, to let the employer know that this accommodation is needed.
There also aren't, and I believe this to be true, and let me know, Joe, if you know differently, there aren't any specific words that have to be used. So you don't necessarily have to use the word disability or accommodation. And I think it can be helpful so that the employer is clear on the fact that that's what you're asking for. So you could just say something like, I have some limitations at work, and I know that I work best with this type of software, and that could be sort of like the starting point for your agreement. And I think it's important that they understand that you're talking about an accommodation, and that they have a legal obligation to provide that accommodation. So as far as I know, there aren't like you need to use these specific words, but your employer should be clear that what you were talking about is an accommodation to help you be able to perform your job to the best of your ability.
Yes, to my understanding, that is true. We want to pause. Are there any other questions so far? I know that was a lot of content, a lot of like complexity content. So any questions so far?
And we also meant to note this at the beginning, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to interject or, to pop something in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer questions throughout as well.
Okay, well, we'll move on. And if any questions come up, please feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat, and we're happy to answer them.
All right, so now we're going to move into disclosing a disability and how and when to do that. So I'm actually going to put a link in the chat right now, and this is a Career Center resource called Disclosure Options for Employment. And I would encourage you to actually open up that resource right now. You will have to click on View Document. But what this sort of worksheet goes through is all of the times of disclosure that are possible and some of the advantages, disadvantages, and issues that you might face disclosing at different times throughout the hiring process. If you have the sheet open already, you can see that the times of disclosure span all the way from right away on a resume or application, all the way down to after experiencing problems on the job or never. And so there are a lot of different reasons why you may want to disclose early or late. And that could depend on what the disability is, how visible your disability is, if there are reasons why it might benefit you to share that disability with an employer early on. For example, if you are applying to a company that works specifically with folks with disabilities, it might be to your advantage to let that company know that you have a disability. Also, if you know that the company has a commitment or a specific, they are specifically recruiting folks with disabilities, right, for affirmative action purposes, or just a company value or commitment that they have, it could be beneficial for you to share that information early. That being said, while disability discrimination is illegal, we still know that employers are people who have biases, and some of that bias can and does creep in to the hiring process. And so if discrimination or bias happens throughout the hiring process, it is actually most likely to happen right away on the resume or application. And so there is an argument to be made for, if there is not a benefit to sharing your disability right away, you may want to wait until a little bit later, until you actually need that accommodation to share that with an employer. And all of this is going to depend on your own level of comfort, what you want or don't want your employer to know. And so it's going to be a very individual and sort of case-by-case decision. And if you're worried about having this conversation or when to have it, I would say you could definitely meet with me or Joe or any other folks that you feel comfortable about who might know about this a little bit about when should you have this conversation. So just a couple of notes. Under the ADA, you can request an accommodation at any time during the application process or while you are employed. So there's no obligation to disclose right away or even before you accept an offer. You can ask for an accommodation at any time. Know who to disclose to. So this is just to say that you don't have to disclose to everyone. The folks who are most likely going to need to know are your human resources department or your direct supervisor. So those would be kind of two go-to places to have this conversation. And you can also always check with the EEO office as well if your organization has one. Don't disclose too soon. So this is, again, just to point out that if bias happens in the hiring process, it is most likely to happen right away. And you might feel like you're not being honest with an employer if you don't share this information right away, but it's important to know that you are under no obligation to share this information until you are comfortable doing so, or until you require an accommodation. Don't disclose too late basically just means, as Joe talked about earlier, employers only have to provide accommodations once they know that there's a need for an accommodation. So if you experience like work performance problems, your employer doesn't have to rescind discipline that occurred before they knew about the disability. So it's better to disclose before you predict that you might start experiencing work performance problems related to your disability. Don't disclose to everyone. And again, this is just pointing again to the fact that you have no obligation to share with your colleagues or workmates, only the folks that are in a need to know category. And then do your homework, which basically means that nobody knows more about your disability than you do. So tell your employer what you think you need, and research accommodation options so that you can ask specifically for, I want this accommodation, and this is how this accommodation will help me perform my job. So again, because you know the most about it, you'll be in a good position to tell your employer, here's some of the limitations I'm facing. Here are the things that I know are helpful for me. And here's what I think would, help me perform my job best. And so you're kind of taking on the responsibility for knowing which accommodations you need. Okay, and then we are going to watch this short video.
Maybe.
Planning and preparing for your disclosure conversation can help you feel a sense of empowerment in your job search process. If you've decided to disclose your disability, you might be wondering, how will I say it? And to whom will I say it? In this video, we'll guide you through the process of preparing your disability disclosure conversation to help you answer those questions. You can use our disclosure checklist and script templates for help. Step 1. Self-reflection. To get started, answer the following questions about your potential job performance. What strengths and abilities do you have that relate to the position you're applying for? For example, I'll say, I am detail-oriented and I am good at communication. What challenges or limitations do you have that are either related to the job you're applying for or the job you are already doing? For example, I'll answer, I have limited motor skills, so I can't type very quickly. What are the job duties that could be difficult to perform? For example, I'll write, I could have trouble taking notes, writing reports, or taking meeting minutes. Are there strategies, tools, or accommodations you've used in the past that have allowed you to perform certain duties more successfully? For example, I'll say, speech recognition software like Dragon helps me. Step 2, develop a disclosure script. Use your answers to the earlier questions to plan what you're going to say when you disclose. This plan is like a script. You can practice ahead of time so that you know what to say when you talk to your employer. Remember to highlight your abilities and clearly state your limitations and needs. Only talk about your limitations related to the job. You don't have to name your disability. However, if you feel comfortable talking about it more directly, you can include it. Here's a template for your script. I have/am, your strengths, skills, abilities, qualifications relevant to the job, and can perform the essential functions of this job, but sometimes, mention your limitations, may impact my ability to describe the duties you may have difficulty performing. I work best when, describe the specific accommodations you need to support the duties you have difficulty performing. This template is just the starting point. You can change it to fit your needs. Here's my script. I am an extremely detail-oriented worker and a skilled communicator who can perform the essential functions of this job, but sometimes my limited motor skills impact my ability to type quickly. This may affect how efficient I am when taking notes, writing reports, and documenting meeting minutes. I work best when I am able to use speech recognition software, such as Dragon. This worked really well for me and my employer in my last job. Now that you have your script, practice it. You can rehearse on your own or practice saying it to someone else. Step 3. Approach your employer. Once you're comfortable, approach a trusted source, such as your manager or someone from the Human Resources Department. They will respect the privacy of your information and be able to direct you to the right sources if you're seeking accommodation. So that's it. I hope this helps you feel more prepared to disclose your disability to an employer. If you need help with this process, reach out to your campus's disability office.
Okay, I really like that video because I think it's a really useful, short, sweet, and straight to the point way about kind of framing it and how to write up that script. So I hope that was helpful. I also want to talk about just some things to consider when thinking about disclosing disability is whether your disability is visible or invisible. That may affect how and when you disclose. If you're someone with a visible disability, you may not even need to disclose because it might be self-evident. You might need to disclose something because it might be evident that you have some sort of condition. Or if you have an invisible disability, you may not need to disclose because your condition is invisible. Maybe it's not relevant to the workplace or to your job. Or maybe because it is, you are going to need accommodations and it's not visible that you have a disability. As I said, is your disability relevant to the workplace and your position? So are you in need of accommodations? Are you going to need accommodations? Or is your disability one that won't affect you at work and you won't need accommodations? And then thinking about the need for accommodations, are there accommodations that you need your employer to provide? Or are there accommodations you can provide yourself? So I'll use the example of, in my job, I need special software to access the computers in my office, and that's something I need my employer to provide. However, there are other electronic tools that I enjoy to help with my disability, such as I like using Grammarly because it's a spell check and grammar check tool, but it's more prominently does the more prominent underlining than the typical built-in spell check does, so it's easier for me to see, and that's something I can just provide myself because that's a built-in extension that I don't need my employer's permission to use. And so thinking about what can you provide yourself and what does your employer need to provide for you. And then, as we've talked about this a little bit in the start of the video about just asking for accommodations. So once you disclose your disability to your employer or to your HR department, you'll begin what is known as the interactive process of requesting accommodations. This process may include individuals such as you, your employer, maybe someone from human resources, and your supervisor. You go through this process together to determine and implement reasonable accommodations. And this is a fluid process. It can begin at any point and can also be re-initiated at any point. So just because you go through it once and set an accommodation doesn't mean you can't go through it again and ask for a different accommodation, for the accommodation to be changed, or ask for additional accommodations.
Awesome. Now we're just going to go over some sort of general job search strategies. If there are any seniors here or folks that are kind of starting to think about the job search process. And these are really strategies that are helpful for anyone looking for a job, but just going to go over some of them quickly and know that the Career Center is a resource to you while you're a student and a year after you graduate, totally free of cost. So if you have questions about job search strategies or anything throughout the job search process, you can also always schedule a one-on-one with me or someone else in the Career Center. So just some general job search strategies. The first is to approach your job search from multiple angles and to try more than one strategy. So online job listings is what people probably most commonly think of, is just looking for job postings online and applying. But there are other strategies that you can use as well. So networking in LinkedIn is just kind of getting to know people in your field and having conversations with them. Networking can be hugely impactful in the job search, and it also has some really inequitable and disproportionate impacts in terms of who is able to benefit from those networks and who isn't. And it's important to know that it can still be a really valuable strategy to get to know people in your field. Employer events and Handshake. So some of you might be familiar with the career fair that's hosted every semester, but there are also events that employers are hosting all of the time. And the good news about things being virtual is that employers all over the country are able to host events for students to attend virtually. Sometimes those are just info sessions or wanting to get to know students. And so you can check Handshake. If you don't have a Handshake account yet, I highly recommend making one. And under the events tab, you can just see what sort of employer events are being hosted. Professional associations and conferences is another strategy. So you might want to get involved with something in your field that's kind of at a national level, and again, get to know people that way, and you might find an opportunity through something like that. Targeting specific companies, so looking, instead of just kind of job searching broadly, if there's a company or a few companies that you know you want to work with, you can be really intentional about targeting those companies specifically. And then the last one would be recruitment programs. So these are programs that are specifically looking to recruit students. And again, I'm going to talk about one recruitment program today called the Workforce Recruitment Program. Okay, so this is just a screenshot of the Career Center website if you haven't been here before, especially if you're just kind of starting out in the job search. There are some helpful tools on this website. You can see in the top right-hand corner, there is a resume icon, and that will take you to our resume template and resume-related resources. The Connect One-on-One button is where you can you sign up for a one-on-one meeting with a career educator to kind of just talk through a plan and some options. And then the Jobs icon will take you to Handshake, which is kind of the hub for all of employers that are wanting to recruit CSU students will post their jobs on Handshake. This is what Handshake looks like. So again, if you haven't made a Handshake profile yet or spent any time on there, I would highly recommend it. But there is a Jobs tab where you can search for job events where employers will host Connect events. And then you can also schedule appointments with Career Center staff through Handshake as well. And then lastly, just wanted to show you the Resource Center. So if you click on Resources and then Resource Center, it'll take you to about, I think it's like over 800 resources at this point. And I actually have clicked Professional Association. So if that was something you were interested in, you can just click on the topics, Professional Association, in your career interest area to find some. It's also worth noting that in the filter sections, there also is an Identities tab, and Students with Disabilities is an Identity tab. So you can find that disclosure options for employment worksheet that we were looking at in that filter as well, along with some other resources there too. Okay, so the Workforce Recruitment Program is managed by the U.S. Department of Labor and Defense, so it's a federal program, and they are looking to recruit specifically students and recent graduates with disabilities in federal and some private sector full-time jobs and internships. So registration for the Workforce Recruitment Program closes on October 14th and applications are due October 15th. So that's actually less than a week from today. To get started with this, you just go to wrp.gov, and I'm going to just put that in the chat as well. And there's a link that says student registration. But what's cool about this is that the amount of jobs and internships available is what we might not commonly think of as like federal jobs. So there's everything from accounting opportunities to art to healthcare to information technology. There's actually a pretty vast, there are vast options for the types of jobs and internships that you could get through this program. And we are actually having an info session or just kind of like office hours for folks that have questions about the Workforce Recruitment Program right after this at noon. Cody from the Career Center and myself, who I think is on here. Hi, Cody. And so I will put the link, the Zoom link for that. If you have more specific questions about the Workforce Recruitment Program and how to apply or what it means or what types of opportunities you might be able to find through it, you can also attend those office hours right after this. And this is just what the home page looks like. I'm going to put that in the chat right now. There we go. Okay. And then one last sort of just general advice for job searching is to make a job search plan. So, you know, if you're graduating maybe this spring and you know that will want to start right away, we'll want to plan ahead a little bit. Job searches can take multiple months, as the average is somewhere around 4 to 6 months. So we'll want to start thinking about that right around kind of winter-ish time. So use your calendar if you're a calendar person. I know it can be kind of an overwhelming thing to start a job search process. And so what's helpful for me, and I know some students have said is helpful for them too, is just putting something on their calendar on like a routine basis to return to job search items. And that could be anything from having someone check their resume to actively applying for jobs to maybe trying to build some connections or looking into professional associations, applying for the workforce recruitment program, but just having kind of a consistent return to your job search, almost like putting it like a class just in your calendar, so that you can return to it often. And you'll want to think about how early will you want to start this process, and that could depend on how much you need to start right away after graduation, or if you have a little bit of cushion time, if it's okay if it's not for a couple months. How frequently do you want to dedicate time to your job search? And then of the strategies that we talked about, which strategies seem like they will be most useful to you? And then like I said, just estimate that the process may take multiple months and often does. Okay, and then finding and researching employers. And so these are really, if you are looking for employers that you want to be sure are going to fully support you in your disability beyond maybe some of their legal obligations, right? But really sort of embrace you in all of your identities. There are some resources for finding employers that have, specifically either have like a diversity and inclusion statement or a commitment. And so, or if you're just looking for employers that, that have kind of like a good reputation and experience with hiring other folks with disabilities. So one strategy is to use a disability specific job board. And so I have some of the disability specific job boards listed on the right here. And I realize that having links is not that helpful in the presentation. I can copy those and put them in the chat as well. But there are at least 4, and this is just the beginning of job boards specifically for people with disabilities. The next is to look for a non-discrimination policy, or better yet, a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So a non-discrimination policy can be, again, just kind of like a legal obligation, but there are a lot more companies that are actively looking to diversify their workforce and recognizing the value and having people with all sorts of identities as part of their workforce, and so are really committed to hiring people with a vast array of identities, including folks with disabilities. And so you can see on their company website, do they have this as a value that they're kind of openly talking about on their website. The Disability Equality Index is also a measure of, how well have certain companies been doing in hiring and retaining employees with disabilities. And so you can also check out the Disability Equality Index if that is interesting to you. And then asking intentional questions in your interview. So these don't necessarily have to require disclosure, but an interview is not just a chance for an employer to get to know you and if they want to hire you. It's also a chance for you to get to know the employer and if that's a place that you want to work and where you can thrive and be your best self. And again, this might depend on how much you feel like I just need a job and, whatever that job might be, I need to pay the bills, versus I want to find the job that is perfect for me and, has everything that I want. But there are some questions you can ask that just kind of get at, how do you promote a diverse and inclusive workplace? What are your company's commitments to diversity and inclusion? And you see how those don't necessarily require disclosure, but you can get a lot from that answer in terms of finding out more about an employer and their commitments and values. And then lastly, the workforce recruitment program again. And I see that there's a question about the workforce recruitment program. So why does the workforce recruitment program close down registrations at a certain point rather than having rolling registrations? That is a great question, Barbara. And I don't actually know. I don't know why they have a firm cutoff. I will ask them that question and email them and maybe let you know later.
Hey,
Okay.
Madigan.
Oh yeah, Cody, go ahead.
This is Cody from the Career Center, and I just added some additional context for that deadline in the chat as well. But basically, they're doing informational interviews for applicants in like the end of October, beginning of November, and then they applicants that are extended job offers generally start to receive those job offers like in January, I believe. And so it's just because the federal process of obtaining a job is so lengthy that they have to have like a particular deadline. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Cody.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay. And then just some, again, job searching tips and tricks. And this is kind of based on things that I wish that all students knew, and some things that I think, you know, just can be really valuable as you're starting your job search. The first is never undersell or undervalue your skill set. So I meet with students all the time, and I would say that I consistently find that students don't think that their skill sets are that important or that unique. And I guarantee you that your skill set is valued, it's important, and it is needed in the workforce. And so when you're, you know, filling out that resume, when you're talking in interviews, don't undersell your skill sets as being invaluable. Your confidence in your own skill sets and what you have to bring is really important when finding and landing positions. Prepare for interviews like you prepare for tests. So make a study guide, know the material, and practice. And this is just to say, try to anticipate questions that they might ask. You won't be able to predict everything, but research the company ahead of time, do your homework, and kind of come prepared for those interviews. And then practicing is always a great way to get more comfortable, because interviews are kind of just by nature an uncomfortable experience. And so the more that you practice it, the more comfortable you'll get. And we do mock interviews in the Career Center as well. Come with your own questions. So often employers will ask at interviews, what questions do you have for us? We already talked about some of those kind of organizational culture questions you might consider asking, but you can ask whatever questions you're really interested in knowing, and send a thank you after interviews. I think that goes a long way with employers as well. Be overly specific rather than overly vague and provide examples. So this is true again for the resume and application materials, but also when interviewing. Show that you have the skills rather than just telling that you have the skills by being really specific in your examples, and providing examples wherever you can. And then lastly, tailor your application materials to every single job. This can also make a big difference, and have someone look over those materials, and multiple people. If you have multiple people, again, the Career Center can do this for you. Okay, so some big takeaways, and we're nearing sort of the end of content here, and so would love to answer questions as they come through. But some takeaways for just sort of navigating the hiring process as a person with a disability and the workplace. When applying for applications, promote your enthusiasm, skills, and qualifications for the job first and foremost. Those are the things that are going to be most important, and really kind of get you those opportunities. Wait to disclose until you want to, or until you require an accommodation. You are under no obligation to disclose your disability right away. Talk not only about the limitations of your disability, but also about the strengths. So this is an option when you're whenever you decide to have that disclosure conversation. You can also talk about how your disability has given you certain strengths, such as independence, ability to navigate challenges, having a unique perspective, being aware of the needs of a diverse clientele, right? These are all really valuable things. And so disabilities can certainly pose challenges, and also can provide strengths that employers really need in their employees and in their workforce. And so you can emphasize both parts of that. Lastly, or second to lastly, understand your own disability and accommodation needs well, so that you can clearly articulate those. You will want to describe how, like she did in the video, how each accommodation will help you accomplish your goals and perform your job tasks. And then Joe mentioned this earlier, but if you don't want to disclose, see if you can self-accommodate, or what things you can self-accommodate.
Okay, we want to just talk about a couple quick resources that can be helpful. The first is the Job Accommodation Network at askjan.org. This is a really useful website that has tons and tons of information about different accommodations, how they might work in different workplaces. So if there's an accommodation you think you need but aren't sure how to approach it or what it might look like, this is a great resource for researching some of that. As Madigan said, the Career Center has a ton of resources on their website, specifically some for people with disabilities. And finally, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, is also a really good resource for researching job-related accommodations and different policies around disability discrimination in the workplace. We want to thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate you coming and listening to us. If you have any questions, we do have about 10 minutes left, so please feel free to post them in the chat, unmute and ask, or if you want to ask questions more privately, you can email either Madigan or I, and our emails are on the screen. My email is joe.tyner, joe.tiner @colostate.edu.
And my email is madigan.turnquist@colostate.edu. And if any students do want to meet just in terms of creating like a job search plan or that sort of thing, you can make an appointment with me on Handshake. You can also just email me directly to set that up if that's something that you're interested in. So again, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I hope this information was valuable, useful. Joe and I can hang around certainly until noon, and then if you want to hop over to that WRP office hours session, feel free, but we can hang out for a bit if folks have lingering questions. Otherwise, thanks so much for being here and have a great weekend.